Now, in case you were worried that the politicians don't know what they're doing with the budget, the governments and populations around the world don't have access to enough advice and might not be up to all the challenges they face at the moment, you can rest assured we've all been given a bit of sage advice, some encouragement about how to make the world a better place by none other than the former Princess Meghan Markle.
Women, and especially women of colour, have seen a generation of economic gain wiped out. Since the pandemic began, nearly 5.5 million women have lost work in the US, and 47 million more women around the world are expected to slip into extreme poverty. But if we work together to bring vaccines to every country and continent, insist that vaccines are equitably distributed and fairly priced, and ensure that governments around the world are donating their additional vaccines to countries in need, then we can begin to fully rebuild.
Yeah, thanks for that, Duchess. That's all we need is lectures to the world from a woke former princess. Anyway, she's about to have her second child, and good luck to the former royal couple on that. Baby news is always good news. But it leads us to the other story that we discussed yesterday, and that is breastfeeding. Well, as you know, I should say now, chest feeding, because even the Australian Breastfeeding Association now says chest feeding is actually for blokes as well as for mums. Now, the association wouldn't put anyone up to talk to us about this. They don't want to talk about this issue, which is kind of strange and is a great pity. But we've joined by Victoria's Shadow Health spokesperson, Georgie Crozier. Georgie, good to talk to you again. Isn't it just nonsense that we need to be so inclusive about something that's so motherly and so obviously feminine as breastfeeding?
Oh, total nonsense, Chris. I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, it's just a noisy minority that are trying to impart their views on something that, as you say, is so normal. The terms like mother and breastfeeding to be changed to parenting and chest feeding is just ridiculous.
Now, we can understand why activists get involved in these sorts of issues. They want to push their social agenda. They usually get government grants to do this, as in this case. I think there's a government grant to produce a pamphlet and all that. But why don't we get resistance? Why doesn't an organisation like the Australian Breastfeeding Association, which used to be Nursing Mothers Federation, why don't they push back and say, no, actually, we know about motherhood. This is our vocation over many, many years. We'll stick with what we know.
Well, they have. They've got a long, proud history. I mean, they were formed in the 60s, I think, from my recollection. I'm a former midwife, so I've seen many women who've got the support from associations like this, who've provided tremendous support to new mothers. And in that very vulnerable time, for the bonding and to be able to breastfeed is so important. But I would hope that they would push back on this. It is this very critical part of, a mother in that with their newborn in the first stages and first days and weeks and months, while they are breastfeeding, is critical for an infant's development. So I hope they will push back on some of this that is being put upon them, and really talk about the quite normal and reasonable and common sense approach to breastfeeding, mother to mother, and allow that to be quite open and not be pushed into the corner by some minority, just a few people that want to have their way and try and have this gender-inclusive language that is becoming the norm, so they think, in their world.
Yeah, look, I think we can all be inclusive in this world. I think we all need to accept and make trans people feel comfortable. We're all aware of that. No one's looking to ostracise trans people. But there's a big difference between that and then trying to normalise something like two men and chest feeding. And it confuses children. I heard a 7-year-old the other day telling me that men could have babies. And, you have to actually explain that this is not the case. You have to explain basic biology. Do you have concerns about that children being confused about these issues?
Oh, totally. I think children are becoming confused by exactly that story that you've just said. And you're right. I mean, I know trans people and they're tremendous. There's nothing wrong with that, and they've got a right to have their views and to express that. But I don't think putting this sort of language around just dehumanising a mother or breastfeeding and changing the terminology to chest feeding is going to assist. And I just think that it is confusing for children, as you've described. And I just think that mothers should be allowed to be mothers, and breastfeeding is quite an appropriate term. And just let everybody just get on with what is quite a natural occurrence with a mother to be able to breastfeed. And for those transgender people, if they want to describe what they're going through in different terms, then that's fine too. But I don't think we should be changing the vast majority of what most mothers are experiencing because just of a noisy few activists who think that they want to have this put upon associations like the ABA or others.
What's the role for government then? We look for governments, especially coalition governments, to lead in the fight back against identity politics, but of course you don't want governments prescribing what words people should use. How do we get leadership from government, state and federal against this sort of activism?
Well, that's quite right. I think that's a really good question. I mean, we do want freedom, people to be able to have freedom of speech and expression and views and to be able to impart that. I mean, I'm so supportive of that notion. That's incredibly important that in a thriving democracy like Australia that is allowed. But I don't think that, a noisy activist group that wants to change the way that the vast majority of people think, that is just a very normal common sense approach to things like child rearing and breastfeeding, that they should have the entire say on this. And that's where governments need to take a common sense approach. I mean, we just need to step back and have a common sense approach, have that leadership that you described from government and say it's okay for the transgender community to have their say, but really these very small activists that are becoming more vocal, taking over the expressions that the vast majority of us are comfortable with, I think then governments can say, look, you need to understand that the vast majority of Australians and mothers and fathers and others are very comfortable with breastfeeding and the notion of breastfeeding.
Thanks for joining us, Georgie. Good to have some common sense.
Thank you, Chris.
Georgie Crozier there, the Shadow Health spokesperson for the Victorian opposition. There you go. You just got to have common sense on these issues and governments have got to speak up.